What form of literature is Genesis? I know that maybe seem a little bit academic, but when it comes to the book of Genesis, we do need to be aware of the kind of writing we are reading. Forms of reading may not very often cross your mind, but if you think about it, you do have different expectations for different genres of reading. You read different things in different ways. We naturally do it. For example, if I give you a few different book titles, with the titles, you will probably begin to understand what I'm saying. Here are a couple book titles. Grab onto these. The Life and Times of George Washington Carver, John Carter of Mars, Selected Poetry of Emily Dickinson, and The Communist Manifesto. Now, hopefully, just with the titles, you can see that these are all books, but they're all different genres or styles of books. And the person picking up the various books would have quite different expectations when reading these books. For example, The Life and Times of George Washington Carver is a biography about the godly American inventor and farmer. In reading that book, you will learn about life in the post-Civil War South. It's a book that relays history around George Washington Carver. However, if you open John Carter of Mars and read it as a biographical history, you would be in for a big shock. Because even though John Carter begins in the post-Civil War America, like George Washington Carver, as you can see from the title, it goes to a much different place. Likewise, if you read the poetry of Emily Dickinson, who also was alive in America post-Civil War, even though she was a real person, unlike John Carter, you would not read her poetry as a biography. Her vivid imagery and prose take you down far different ways of thought than reading science fiction novel or a biography would like George Washington Carver. Nor would you grab the Communist Manifesto and reading expecting to find poetry or a good lighthearted adventure in space or a biography or something else entirely. It's written as a polemic or an argument for a certain way of thinking, a certain philosophy. My point is, knowing your genre matters. So, what kind of genre or writing then is the book of Genesis? Is it a poem? Is it a history book? Is it an allegory? Is it an apologetic? Is it an ancient science book? Is it a self-help book? I mean, this is very important because Genesis 1 is structured as a poem, as are other passages in Genesis. But what we need to realize that Genesis, though containing poetry, linguistic wordplay, and strong polemic language, is a historical narrative text. First off, historical narrative is not what we think of as a history book. It's not a dense collection of facts. Rather, it's more in line with the George Washington Carver biography, as I mentioned earlier. Historical narrative is the representation of selected past events for the purpose of instruction. Now, note the word selected past events, not exhaustive past events. In short, the author of Genesis, or other historical narratives for that matter, are not trying to record every possible event they can find dealing with the subject matter. In other words, Moses, as the author of Genesis, is not recording every possible event he can dig up. Although for the sake of the study, that would have been helpful. But remember, he was on limited parchment, for one. But rather, even more importantly, Moses is selecting particular themes, and get this, particular themes, events, and ideas for a particular reason. Moses is using a practice called the principle of selectivity. Another one of those crazy exegetical principles. First contemporization, and now selectivity. The principle of selectivity is an idea we'll pack as we go. But right now, just hold on to the idea that Moses is the author of Genesis, has a reason he recorded the events he did, a reason he selected the events he did, and a reason he recorded them in the particular literary style, whether it be poetry or just long form narrative that he did. In historical narrative, the author tells stories or events he chooses for a particular purpose. He uses his selectivity to do it. He not only selects certain events, but certain vocabulary and terminology. And these are good for our categories of understanding. In other words, much of the vocabulary and terms we fly over in Genesis 1 through 3 has a far deeper meaning in regards to the rest of the Torah. What we need to step back and ask is, What was the reason the author chose to record certain events in Genesis 1 through 3 in the way he did? This is very key, very key. Poetry, wordplay, word pictures, and various other forms of literature that you've already forgotten that you probably learned in high school English are all used in this book. Among other things, Moses was a literary master when putting this together. Moses has put Genesis 1 through 3 together in a way that is more of an art form than just plain linear history. And we've got to grasp that. If the book of Genesis was a movie, we're seeing the parts of the movie the director, in this case Moses, wants us to see. We cut in and out at the scenes he wants us to see. We pull back the lens at the scenes he wants us to see. The author through the text is creating our view. He is crafting how we see these historical events, and we're seeing this movie from the angle of the viewpoint he wants us to see. So hear me here. We need to pay more attention to what he leaves in his account than what he leaves out of his account. Remember, Genesis is not so much written with history or science in mind. Rather, it's written with theology in mind, a strong, robust theology in which the children of Israel can base the foundation of their kingdom on. Science changes. History is sadly forgotten, but knowing God is the chief end of man. Let me end with the warning from Old Testament theologian John Sailhammer. Sailhammer said that we as readers are not free to do or say whatever we or he or she pleases about the meaning of a text. The reader must understand the text in the terms dictated by the grammatical constraints of the language in which it's written. And while it is true that reading biblical text is more than merely a grammatical, syntactical, and lexical study of the biblical Hebrew Bible, it is certainly not less. As readers of these biblical texts, we stand before them as their authors have constructed them, and we look to them, the texts themselves, for our understanding of the world they depict. And it's our job to see what they're trying to teach us about God.